Riley's heart pounded as she laid the evidence in front of Officer Thompson, his once cocky smirk vanishing as the truth hit him like a freight train. The man who had slashed at her dignity was now exposed, but as the station held its breath, she knew this was just the beginning. What happened next would shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The sting of the slap lingered in Riley's skin, a burning sensation that felt more like a deep violation than a physical blow. The cold night air, once a soft balm against her tired limbs, now felt suffocating, thick with the weight of what had just occurred. Her hand instinctively moved to her cheek, but the pain wasn't just from the slap. It was the humiliation, the rawness of it all. She had been a target, singled out for reasons she couldn't comprehend. Was it her gender, her youth, the way she looked, the way she walked? Her mind, still hazy with shock, tried to make sense of the senselessness. But all she could feel was the overwhelming urge to scream, to push the oppressive silence around her. Mark Thompson wasn't just any cop. He was the kind of officer who believed the rules applied only to those he deemed beneath him. To him, the badge wasn't a responsibility. It was a weapon, something to be wielded with the authority of someone who saw themselves as untouchable. Riley had always been keenly aware of the power dynamics between police officers and civilians, but this felt different. This wasn't just a cop enforcing the law. It was a man using his power to assert control, to belittle, to humiliate. His eyes had held nothing but arrogance, the way they had narrowed as he delivered the slap, as if he were punishing her for some imagined slight. He hadn't even cared to ask her name, to hear her side of things, to offer the slightest bit of respect. She had been at the mercy of someone who considered himself above reproach. She stood frozen, caught in the sharp, disorienting wave of anger and disbelief that flooded through her. The tears she wanted to shed would not come, stifled by the confusing swirl of emotions that left her feeling both powerless and furious. Her legs felt rooted to the pavement, as though the weight of his dominance had left an indelible mark on the ground beneath her. The last words he said, "You should watch where you're going, sweetheart," echoed in her mind, each syllable carrying a layer of condescension that made her stomach churn. He walked away without a second glance, his boots tapping on the concrete with a casual rhythm that contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside her. Riley was left in the quiet aftermath, her entire body trembling, not just from the cold, but from something much deeper. It wasn't just the physical violence. It was the systemic cruelty behind it. The callousness of an officer who used his authority not to protect, but to harm. And as the silence of the night settled around her, she felt an undeniable fire ignite within her, a quiet rage building in her chest, settling into her bones. She didn't know yet what she would do, but in that moment, Riley knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a slap. This was about standing up to something far larger than herself, and she would not let it go unanswered. Riley stood in the harsh fluorescent light of her apartment, her cheeks still tingling where Mark's slap had landed, and yet it wasn't the physical pain that consumed her. That was nothing more than a dull, throbbing reminder of the real wound, a wound to her belief in justice, to her trust in the system she had once vowed to be a part of. It was the shame of being reduced to nothing more than a target, an object to be controlled, that ate at her core. She had been mocked, humiliated in front of no one but herself, and it was worse than any bruise. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she stared at her reflection in the dim mirror above the sink. The face looking back at her seemed like a stranger, someone she didn't recognize. It was as if, in that moment, the world had opened up, and she was suddenly no longer part of the idealistic vision she had once held. The life she imagined for herself, a life of service and integrity, of standing with those who had no voice, had been shattered in a moment of arrogance. All her years of dedication, all the nights spent studying the law, honing her skills, dreaming of making a difference, had led to nothing but this raw, bitter moment of betrayal. Mark Thompson's slap had ripped away any sense of trust she'd ever had in the system. He had been an officer, someone who swore an oath to protect, yet he had used his badge not to defend, but to oppress. That slap had cut deeper than any physical injury. It was a reminder that power could be misused, that those entrusted with justice could become its greatest abusers. She had always known deep down that the world wasn't perfect, that there were flaws in every system, but she had never imagined it could be so personal. He wasn't just a bad cop. He was a man who had crossed the line, and she had been the victim of his indifference. Her mind raced, flickering between anger and disbelief, until a new realization began to take root. As she wiped the tears from her eyes, still hot from the sting of the slap, she began to piece together something even more chilling. The man who had reduced her to nothing had a history, multiple complaints, a trail of women he had humiliated, belittled, and hurt. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a dangerous one. Her chest tightened as the truth sank in. Mark wasn't just an officer who had made one mistake. He was a predator, using his badge as a shield to hide his cruelty. The thought of the other women he had abused, the countless moments where he had bullied or intimidated them without consequence, filled her with a fury that was almost suffocating. She had seen it before. The quiet whispers in the halls of the department, the unspoken knowledge that certain officers were untouchable, immune to accountability. But it was different now. She wasn't just hearing rumors. She had been a victim of it. Riley's hand clenched into a fist, the urgency of the situation propelling her forward. She couldn't just stand back and accept that this would be her story, her legacy, of being a woman who had let herself be beaten by the very system she had devoted herself to. This wasn't just about her. It was about every woman who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been abused by their supposed protectors. Riley had been reduced to the victim, but now she would become the one who fought back. The rage swelled inside her like an uncontainable force, pushing away the doubt and fear. She would make him pay for what he had done, for everything he had stolen from her, from all of them. The tears that had been threatening to spill stopped. Her face, once pale and shaken, now reflected a new resolve. The anger was sharp, cutting through her pain. This was no longer just a personal attack. This was an attack on everything she had ever believed in. And now she was going to make sure Mark Thompson couldn't get away with it. He would face the consequences of his actions. No more silence. No more hiding behind a badge. She was ready to make her move. Riley stood at the entrance of the police station, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind clear and determined. The familiar, sterile scent of the building seemed almost foreign now, as if the walls themselves had turned into something oppressive, a constant reminder of the corruption she was about to confront. She had thought of this moment all night, replayed every word, every possible move in her mind. The uniform she wore now felt heavier than it ever had, but it was the weight of justice, not a mere fabric. She had a job to do, a job that was much larger than herself. As Riley walked through the doors, she felt every eye in the room shift toward her. The officers, who had once known her as the eager, quiet rookie, who always followed the rules, now looked at her as if seeing someone they didn't recognize. Their stares were full of curiosity, surprise, and some even a flicker of concern. But Riley wasn't there for their approval. She wasn't there to explain herself. This wasn't about them. It was about one man, Mark Thompson, and the damage he had done. Mark was standing near the desk, just as arrogant as ever, his smirk wide and condescending. He looked up, saw Riley, and the familiar cocky expression on his face froze. His eyes scanned her uniform, his gaze flickering with confusion and then something more like unease. But he quickly masked it with a shallow chuckle, the familiar arrogance returning in waves. Well, look who finally decided to show up, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. What, are you here to cry about what happened last night? Get over it. His words hit Riley like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. If anything, the sting of his taunt only steeled her resolve. She had spent too many years training for this moment, too many nights honing her skills and studying law enforcement not to understand how to handle him. The rage that had burned inside her the night before was now something deeper, something colder, sharper. This wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about duty. She was no longer the woman he had slapped. She was a symbol of the very justice he had corrupted. Get over it? Riley repeated, her voice steady, controlled, colder than it had ever been. Her words cut through the thick air of the station, silencing the murmurs from the other officers. Mark's smirk faltered, just slightly, as he took a step back. He had no idea what was coming. Riley's hand moved to her bag, pulling out the folder she had prepared, the contents heavy with years of complaints, reports, and undeniable evidence. She laid it out in front of him, each piece a damning accusation that built a case against him. The room seemed to shrink as she watched Mark's confident demeanor crack. Piece by piece, his eyes flickered across the documents. Those words he had thought could remain hidden, buried under layers of privilege and protection. But now they were here, laid bare for him to see. Mark's smirk turned to confusion, then to something darker. Fear. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. His throat seemed to tighten as he processed what was happening. The trap was set, and he had walked right into it. But Riley wasn't done. "You've hurt people, Mark," she said, her eyes narrowing as she leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "And now you're going to answer for it." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. She didn't need to say anything else. The weight of her accusation, the truth she had exposed, was more than enough. Mark stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing, trying to find a way out. But there was no escape this time. Riley had made sure of that. There were no more games, no more arrogant taunts. The power had shifted. It was his turn to answer. The moment the higher-ups were forced to act, the weight of Mark Thompson's career crumbling under the undeniable truth was palpable. The air in the station felt thick, suffocating as Riley stood by, watching the pieces fall into place. Internal Affairs had already confirmed the evidence, and the storm she had set in motion couldn't be stopped. The officers who had once looked the other way, who had allowed the corruption to fester and grow, now watched in silent dismay as their colleague, their once untouchable Mark Thompson, was let out in handcuffs. The arrogant swagger that had defined him was gone, replaced by a strange, almost desperate fear in his eyes. His world, built on lies and manipulation, was collapsing. It was no longer just a personal victory for Riley. It was a victory for the system itself, a reminder that there were those who still believed in accountability, in justice. Riley had taken the very institution that had failed her and turned it into a mirror, forcing it to face its own flaws. And as she watched Mark, once the embodiment of unchecked power, being escorted out, she could feel the weight of everything she had fought for in that single defining moment. The officers, the ones who had either ignored or actively covered up his actions, now had to confront the uncomfortable reality of their silence. They had let him get away with it because they were either afraid to speak up or too complicit to care. Now they saw the cost of that silence, a career destroyed, a legacy shattered. And yet there was something else in the air, a shift. As the station processed the truth, Riley saw a glimmer of hope in some of the faces that had once been indifferent. It wasn't just about one man being exposed. It was about something larger, an awakening, a realization that things didn't have to be the way they had always been. Riley stood tall, her heart still racing from the adrenaline of it all. But there was elation in her triumph. There was a quiet sense of relief mixed with an undercurrent of something deeper, anger, pain, and something else. Pride. She had faced down a system of corruption and won. She had fought for what was right, for what she believed in, even when it felt like the entire world was against her. It had been the hardest battle of her life, but she had emerged victorious, not just as a woman who had stood up for herself, but as a woman who had stood up for what was right. And in that victory, she realized something far more profound. She hadn't just brought justice to one man. She had become the change she had always dreamed of. All those years of training, all the nights spent studying the law, all the moments when she had doubted herself had led her to this point. She wasn't just a police officer anymore. She had become a symbol, a beacon of courage, resilience, and truth. Her journey was no longer just about being a part of the system. It was about shaping it, holding it accountable, and making sure it never forgot the people it was meant to protect. Her world had crumbled, yes, but in its destruction, Riley had rebuilt something stronger, something more meaningful. And in that rebuilding, she found not just redemption for herself, but hope, for a future where justice was more than a word, and where courage was something that could transform even the darkest of places.